So as we move into Act 1, Scene 3, there's a lot of war talk. We meet the Duke and the second senator and the first senator and a sailor. Essentially, what Shakespeare establishes here is that they're in a state of war. You could argue that this, again, drives forward the idea of the play being a tragedy, that the war is a catalyst for Othello and Desdemona's isolation, segregation in Cyprus, and a way to remove them from the rules and regulations of the Venetian society. You must ask yourself, would Iago have had as much power if they hadn't left the Venetian government behind? There's also another nod in here to something that happens in Act 2. So the messenger reveals that the ships that they want to fight against are moving towards Cyprus, and there's a name drop, like a celebrity name drop, of Signor Montano, who is a trusty and valiant serviceman over there. So this sets up very nicely the fact that in Act 2, Cassio injures Montano, and that's what leads to his demotion. Now, by highlighting in Act 2 his importance to the Cypriot government, we can understand why Othello's hands are tied. And this is a source of frustration across the play. Cassio has it explained to him by Emilia that Othello is asking Cassio for, this is in Act 3, for a couple of weeks, just let it die down. You've injured a very important man. I'll see what I can do. So arguably, Cassio's lack of patience and his desire to restore his reputation immediately is obviously what then leads him to appear to be cheating with Desdemona, which Iago obviously manipulates. So we could argue that if Cassio had just accepted Othello's very, very worthwhile point that he's injured someone important and let it rest for 2 weeks, then he wouldn't have put himself into Iago's hands. So this is a flaw of Cassio's, that he is determined to get things sorted as soon as possible, instead of actually just behaving maturely. So you could argue that in a bid to protect his reputation, he actually acts in his worst way. Now, this theme can be applied to several other characters. Othello also does the same thing. When his reputation is questioned through Iago's accusations about his wife, he also behaves in his worst possible way. So the message there might be perhaps that Shakespeare's highlighting that when we lose something that's important to us, it actually can bring out our worst side, or that maybe that sometimes we are counterproductive in trying to protect the thing that we want the most. We actually end up undermining ourselves. So returning back to Act 1, Scene 3, we've got that beautiful name drop of Signor Montano ready so we can understand. And then we've then got two lovely quotations where Othello is called valiant by the Duke and the first senator. This is really highlights to us Othello's reputation as a general. He is valued, and you could argue this is where his confidence comes from. He feels at home on the battlefield, and he knows that he is respected there. Brabantio then sort of emphasizes the effect that this marriage has had on him. He says that he is in a state of grief, which obviously perhaps might evoke some sympathy from the audience, and highlights really the extent to which Desdemona's actions have caused him to suffer. This is even more important when we realise that he later dies of his grief in Act 4/Act 5 when they find out. And there's a lovely metaphor here that he believes that his grief swallows other sorrows, that his grief overpowers the sorrow of the war and everything else that the Duke needs to discuss. He believes that his sorrow, that his daughter has betrayed him like this, is more important than everything else. This is cemented when somebody says, "Is your daughter dead?" And Brabantio says, "Aye, to me." And obviously that sets up the idea that Desdemona has left behind one man to go into the arms of another man. And essentially how much Desdemona lost. She lost her father, who clearly did care for her, and as a result, she then ends up in the arms of someone who then kills her. Really, she made a pretty bad choice. Once Brabantio has explained then that Desdemona has been, quote, stolen from him and corrupted by spells and medicines, the Duke promises that he will bring this person to the bloody book of law. And Brabantio is very grateful. Of course, when the Duke finds out that it is Othello and that actually he hasn't tricked her, she actually did go willingly, the Duke refuses to do anything to Brabantio. It's important to realise that the Duke does not ignore Brabantio's request just because it's Othello. If Othello had won Desdemona by magic, it does not matter that Othello is a general. The Duke would have punished him, or at least that's what we can assume by the fact that when she found out it was Othello, she asked him what had happened, and she didn't just throw the case out. Also, she really wanted sorry, I'm saying she because of the film version we watched. He really wanted evidence and refused to accept just Brabantio's word for it. This is significant because later on, Othello equally does ask for evidence of Desdemona's cheating. You could argue that Othello doesn't wait for as much high quality evidence as that which is presented to the Duke, and that he perhaps accepts weaker evidence. And then you could debate to what extent, to what that suggests about Othello's personality, his character. Does he almost want to believe that Desdemona is cheating on him at this point? And this is something we're looking at in Act 3, that from the minute he doubts her, he almost wants it to be true, just so he doesn't have to spend the rest of his life doubting. Like the minute you start doubting someone, he won't be able to control that. A bit like Inception, the ideas in his head. We'll come back to that in Act 3 though. So Othello then speaks in front of the Duke, and this is a really important speech to establish Othello's insecurities and also his ability to deal with different situations. Throughout the play, we'll see him battling between being a soldier and a general and being a lover and a man of peace. So here he starts with most potent, grave and reverend signors. We can infer that he's very respectful and that his vocabulary is actually very appropriate for his setting. He can adapt his register for the situation that he's in. Yet he then says a few lines later, rude am I in my speech and little blessed with the soft phrase of peace. He suggests there that he's not capable of expressing himself clearly in a situation of peace, so basically off a battle zone, or off a battlefield, sorry. Of course, right now we're seeing him express himself very clearly. So that you could argue there's a level of insecurity there, or he's just being respectful. He's undermining his own talents in a society which usually did that for him. He also says that he has been on a battlefield since he was 7, till now some 9 moons wasted. So he's only been off the battlefield for 9 months. That means he's only known Desdemona for the maximum time of 9 months. You can argue, therefore, that they are very young, that their relationship is very young, and therefore that is another reason why Othello might find it harder to trust Desdemona later on in the play. It highlights as well that Othello really is used to fighting and violence, and that he has been raised in that scenario, in those situations. You can question to what extent his upbringing then has led him to think that violence is possibly always the answer. And given that we learn in a few lines that he was stolen into slavery as a young child, he's never really known what it feels like to have a mother or to be in love with anybody. This puts him under a lot of pressure with Desdemona. He obviously wants this relationship to work. He's probably waited a long time to find love in his life. And it perhaps makes it more tragic then that it fails so quickly because of one flaw and because of one person.